Hey friends, and welcome to The Architecture of Story, a podcast for writers from writers that focuses on pulling together resources to help you structure your dream novel. I'm your host, author, and editor Meg Rosenthal, and I'm so glad that you are here. The Architecture of Story has become a passion project of mine because it's a platform that I wish existed when I first was learning how to build my own novels. It is my hope that breaking down the architecture within stories will help make the abstract concept of writing a book slightly more tangible. So whether you are a beginning writer or an established author, I can't wait to put our architect brains together and expand on the conversation of that universal thread which ties us all together: story. Hello and welcome to The Architecture of Story. I am your host, Meg Rosenthal, and I'm so happy that you guys are here today. Y'all, I have been so excited for this episode. When I first thought about launching this podcast series, the very first person that I thought about getting on this pod was none other than my own mentor, professor, the woman who taught me almost everything I know. Her name is Sarah Creech, and she is here with us today. I met Professor Creech because she was my professor at Queen's University of Charlotte. But aside from her academic success as a professor, she is also a novelist herself. She is the author of 2 novels, The Season of the Dragonflies and The Whole Way Home. She's had several short stories published and appearing in various publications. And yeah, like I said, she's an amazing individual with a very unique perception of the world. She looks at the world in a very narrative structure and feel, and I just walk away from every conversation with her feeling that much smarter because of her insight. So you guys are in for a treat today. We talk at length about moving from short form fiction to long form fiction, but what the benefits of short form fiction writing can be, especially within workshop within a classroom. We talk a lot about how she incorporates workshop and critique groups into the educational field, why that is beneficial, and then what you can learn from the short form and apply it to long form as well. And then we get briefly into the 3-act story structure of the novel at the end, using a recent book that she has read where the author actually came to Queen's University to do a public speaking event about. Very exciting. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Architecture of Story. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited that you're here. Everyone, this is one of my favorite people in the entire world. This is Professor Creech. Professor Sarah Creech. I went to Queen's University. She was my advisor, my mentor, professor for most of my fiction classes since we went to a small college. And I am so happy that you are here today.
Don't forget travel abroad teacher too, because we took that wonderful trip to London.
Oh my gosh, we went, my senior year, we went for 2 weeks to London. Studying abroad, and made my inner history literary nerd so excited. And what I really wanted to talk with you about today was kind of the journey that you and I went on ourselves too when I was doing my undergrad for creative writing. A lot of what we worked on in the college classroom was short form fiction, and then when I approached you my senior year, I'm like, I want to write a book. You were the one to kind of take me under your wing and show me how to do it. So I figured it'd be kind of a good backup and punt episode, and let's make sure that we all have our basic building blocks on the skills that you would need before you would dive into a full-length novel. And once you're ready from there, how do you implement the 3-act story structure?
Love it.
All right, so getting into the bulk of our work for today. So I want to chat a little bit about short form fiction because I feel like there was and I don't know if you feel like this too. I think it happened probably during COVID too, when everyone was locked down and not able to go outside. I feel like there was a huge surge in, like, at least in the social media side of things, like book talk. There's a huge surge in people reading again, huge surge of people writing again. Personally, I went back to a pretty, I just graduated from college. I went back to a little bit of a creative field myself as well, because there was not much else to do. But I think with that, even though that's a beautiful thing that people are returning to creating again, I think there was a little bit of a lack of, at least in these newer writers, like a formal instruction. And what we had at Queen's was a lot of workshopping. Man, it certainly taught you some thick skin, that's for sure. But it's such a huge necessary step to growing as a writer, being able to take criticism and learn from that and apply it to your own works, and then also using that lens to look at other people's works too and see what's working and what's not.
Yeah, so let's start with the pandemic, because so many terrible things happened during that time that
Yeah,
people were turning inward, seeking creativity as a way of connection is one bright spot.
correct.
I think that's something that was beautiful that came out of it. And of course, I can't go, very often without seeing headlines bemoaning the state of literacy in the United States and just how few people read. And we write for readers, and there are fewer and fewer readers. The readers who exist are extremely passionate, and so you can find community in that space, that you can go online and share your work online, and through social media, through book talk, find your people. And I think that's fantastic. I mean, I think it's something that really did open up in the pandemic, though online culture had been there, right? People had been writing fan fiction, posting it on sites, and that had already existed. But the pandemic gave an opportunity for more people who might have been curious or nervous, or maybe who had never written before, an opportunity to try something new because they had time. And there's like only so many shows that you can binge. And so I think, right? You hit a wall, right? Your brain just feels like mush. And so you want to be active. And I mean, that's what writing is. It's brain activity. It's brain exercise. So even if you're just writing for yourself and you don't really seek an audience, it's still like healthy, good work for your brain. Just the way working out, conditioning your body is too. So even if you're just playing with exercises in the creative writing space, it's good for you, for alertness, for your imagination, for purpose. So people write for so many different reasons, and you can find community online. But the workshop model that you and I experienced, in that my students actually lost when we were in the middle of the course you took with me, writing and fiction, and in the middle of that, February came of 2020, and then March of 2020, we had to break. We were in the middle of
I didn't
workshop,
even think
and I
about
said,
that.
"Well,
Yeah,
oh yeah." So we had in-person
right.
workshop for almost half the
Yeah.
semester, and then COVID came, and I was like, "Okay, folks, well, 2 weeks," because that's what
Right.
everybody thought. 2 weeks, we'll be out of the classroom. We're going to try this Zoom classroom world just for 2 weeks, like a patch, while whatever this global virus maybe, reveals itself, takes shape, and hopefully it won't be too bad. I mean, we were really naive.
Right.
I look back at that time, and it's shocking to me what little information we had. And then, of course, workshop became completely online the rest of that semester and into the next
Right.
year. And it just was not the same. It wasn't the same. And I'm in workshop now. I'm in prose capstone with my students, and it's such a small group, and they know each other really well. But the kind of support you get by seeing people's face light up in response to your story, or even their like quizzical face when they're asking you questions and you're asking them questions in real time about really important issues that you're having with your story that you can't solve on your own. Because really, workshop is a problem solving experience where you see these different problems in your story, and you're just one head, and you really want other people's perspective. And a lot of times people will give you ideas that you don't take exactly, but it inspires you in a different direction. I feel like most students end up taking suggestions and making it their own.
Yeah.
Like they don't, it's too hard to take someone else's creativity and apply it exactly. And as a writer myself, I never have that experience, but what people say to me inspires my imagination to come up with the right solution at the,
Sure.
at the right time.
Yeah.
And there's something about the in-person experience that allows for more spontaneity than this kind of experience. And so the in-person workshop model is special. I think that if you've never tried it, even a small writing group will mimic that experience. But it helps to have structure, and that's where craft comes in. And what our conversation will focus on today is that you need a lexicon. It's like, how do we talk about fiction? What language and vocabulary do you use? And I think if you're new to the writing world, no matter your genre, whether you're a poet or creative nonfiction essayist or a fiction writer, you have a different vocabulary, and some of it transfers, some of it doesn't. And when you're with a group of people, you want to have that shared vocabulary to like a quick hand for this is what we're looking at. This is what we want to focus on for problem solving. And it allows your imagination to open up to have that kind of form. So the workshop model, what you come in, you've got maybe 8 to 15 people. It kind of just depends on what class you're in.
That's the beauty of being at a
And
smaller school.
at the small
Yep.
school, right? I mean, you can't really have a workshop with more than 15.
I
Like
can't even
15's
imagine,
pushing
no.
it. Yeah, I have 6 students in my pros capstone right now, and I at the beginning of the semester was worried that would be too
Hmm.
small, and now I see like, oh, what a wonderful intimate experience, because they all show up super ready
Right.
and they're all really bright and they are very supportive of each other. And that means we can have more time for workshop. Like they really can make it their
Hmm.
own and I can step back. But in a class of 15, which I had in writing a workshop, or excuse me, writing a fiction with
Hmm.
you, there's so many people trying to raise a
Right.
hand. Everybody wants to participate and share that. Then I take more of a role trying to orchestrate that
Right.
conversation. So, um, the small group is nice. It really is. And I think the small model really invites a hyper focus on a few pages. And that's why the short story has been the workshop model for so
Right.
long, because if you're trying to read 100 pages, even let's say, all the way to a novel like 350 pages, you're only going to be able to cover like the big picture in a 45-minute workshop, and that's the max. Like a 45 minutes would be the maximum amount of time you would be able to spend on a student before everybody gets tired, where you're like, I just can't talk about this anymore. And so the risk of that is that you never really get into the depths of craft and really thinking through lots of different problem solution for particular issues that you're seeing, because the novel is just so
Right.
large in its scope, in the amount of characters that you can bring in the way it covers time, the risks it can take with structure. And short stories do all of that too, but with the short story, we have 15 pages. And as Edgar Allan Poe always liked to say, it's a unity of effect, right? That there's such a lens and focus on maybe one character, like sort of one action, finite time, a day maybe, and that you are able to control the reader's experience in a short story to have that unity of impact, unity of effect by the end of it. Like that the arc you're able to control the feeling of it in one sitting, where a novel is meant to be put down. You put it down, you come back.
Right.
Now, some novels you simply can't put down. And we know those novels and we want to write those kinds of novels. But with a short story, the intention is a single experience. And so being able to bring that single experience into the workshop and practice problem solving, it's just an easier form to do that
Right.
with. And the problem solving experience of an in-person workshop is not it's not just for the writer, and maybe it's not even mainly for the writer being workshopped. It's for me, the reader. If I am in that space, I'm also a writer. And my ability to come to practice my imagination, like where could the story go? Where could it go? What different kinds of internal conflicts or external conflicts could be, shaping this character's arc. I am writing when I'm doing that.
Yeah.
But it's all in my mind, right? I'm brainstorming as I do that. And it's such good exercise for writers.
Yeah. And I think, like, yes, I've done a lot of research post grad on story structure. And yes, I got a huge education from Queens and the faculty there. But I think, honestly, recapping what a workshop is, that's what I think really set me up post grad to be able to explore this new field and like more of the editing as well, because I come at reading client stories with that lens of basically bringing workshop to life. And so, kind of backing up just a second, if anyone listening is a beginner writer and has never experienced workshops, a workshop for me when we were in undergrad was we would have a short story that we had written. The whole class had written their own stories, and we would rotate each week who, maybe 1, 2, 3 people that we would workshop those stories. And what that meant is you would have read the story and you brought essentially like your notes and your feedback to a circular discussion to have with the author, and say what was working, what wasn't, suggestions for potential revision. Then when you're in the hot seat that first time, it's tough. You've got a lot of eyes on you, and I think especially doing it in a safe manner where you're in a classroom, you can do a little bit of the compliment sandwich of this is really working, and we're going to soften the blow if this really wasn't working. And that's kind of what I try to bring, to my editing clients too, because a lot of times I am getting first timers. If one thing isn't working in a story, that doesn't mean the whole story is a failure. It's just like you said, we could have a lot of different lenses, and that is one of the hard things to, I think, sift through with workshop, especially when you have larger writing groups or a larger classroom. You have a lot of opinions coming at you too, and but you as the writer ultimately have the authority to decide whether you take them or not. But I will say, if you are getting, especially, I get a lot of indie authors coming to me that may or may not have had beta readers, and beta readers are going to kind of mimic this workshop environment as well. They may or may not have had the education that a classroom would have had, but I would say if you get the repetition of similar questions coming back to you, that area definitely needs attention.
I have so much to say.
Oh, I love it.
Yes,
I love it.
It's so true. And it's important for me to hear from students and that feeling that the seat is hot. It's
Yes.
real. And my tushy was in that seat plenty of years. There were times when I went home and wept, and that I was because I was at a master's level, and the egos and the competition, it just gets so intense in those spaces. You feel like the stakes are so high. I'm not even sure what the stakes were. Like,
Agreed.
where when we are released from here, we all have to just keep writing and not quit.
Right.
I mean, that's ultimately the goal. And you're thinking, well, shouldn't everybody in this room be super supportive of each other, actually? Because it's us against a really tough world. But that was not the feeling in my graduate school experience, actually. And I wish it had been.
Because I would agree a little bit. Now Queens, I think, is, again, it was smaller, it was safe, it was, we were all beginners. But there is, and I loved my peers that I was working with too, but I do think, especially in, like, maybe it's because it was more of a formal setting too. Like, we were all educated, we're all, in it together, but there was a little bit of competition, I would say, and maybe I'm just a competitive person by nature. Whereas I think the indie author space that's being cultivated now as a result, or I mean, it's always been there, but I did see more of an explosion of, people going on the self-published track, people writing and trying to be published for the first time post-pandemic. There is, I think, a feeling of, and maybe this is a little naive of me to say, there's a lot of support too, because I think, again, I say this all the time, we live in an era of social media and just media in general, where there's so much art and literature and movies to consume, and your reader is hungry all the time. Like, we, in one way, are never going to be out of business because we consume stories at such a rapid rate right now. So there is, I think, a little bit of a camaraderie amongst beginner authors now of where you're not so much in competition, because if you have a book that one reader enjoys and your book is similar, well, you're going to feed into that same audience too. I think by the time you're exiting the indie space into more of the traditional publishing route, that's definitely much more cutthroat, and it's its own journey. But like, where I've been working with some of the authors now, it is kind of a beautiful, supportive space. But again, I think you're running a little bit of the risk without having that group that may or may not have necessarily had that formal training. I would just be a little bit cautious. Like, the words and the suggestions that they bring back to you may not be gospel, but if the questions are still there, that area needs attention.
I'm heartened to hear you talk about the indie book space, and I love the very positive, like, uplifting community that you're describing and that you found. It makes me so happy for you, because I don't think the competition did me any favors, and I knew I didn't want to run a workshop like that, like the kind that I experienced. Right. But it's taken me time to evolve from what I knew to where I am now. And workshop is not a silent workshop. So students they're deciding what they want their workshop to look like. They're allowed to ask questions along the way. I have different kinds of workshops that they can choose. They can choose the silent workshop where they're just listening to suggestions the entire time. Or they can do a Q&A style workshop if they want to. It just depends on what they need. And I think that makes so much sense. There's no one size fits all for where a story is in the process. Right. So for workshop, you're coming maybe with something half-baked or something you've revised multiple times. If you've revised it multiple times, you probably have really particular questions about that story. So I think choice is super important, and that wasn't really an experience that I ever had, but I think this group of students really, really appreciates it. And it's just a more successful way. And it's more fun for me. It's a more collaborative workshop. And it's nice to see them take ownership of it. But I think ultimately the risk is defensiveness. And that at the end of the day, and that's true for any writer receiving feedback,
Right.
is that you're so close to your story and you're so sure about it. I have this experience all the time, by the way.
Same, literally.
Yeah, that feedback from like right field. You're like, wait, okay, well, you're in right field, but I'm the pitcher. I made this story, and like I know what I'm doing. I'm in control of this ball right now, right? Like right fielder, But they, those readers that are maybe spotting something, and you see a pattern in the feedback, like you just said, there's something to examine there. That doesn't mean that the suggestions that they have for you for how to fix it are the direction for you.
Right.
But hearing them think through your story and maybe where it was feeling cold, right? Where they pulled back as a reader. Well, you need to ask yourself why. Like why did your story lose heat in that moment? And how can you bring that forward?
That image. It's something that I, again, more inner research because I'm such a story nerd. As I was entering more of the editing field, and I've listened to so many podcasts, and it's an excellent way to multitask. I just pop in a headphone in, and I feel like I'm getting a little mini lecture as I'm still doing my chores, which is great. But that is, before I branded myself as entering this editing field, like I did a lot of work on, I know what I want to bring to the table, and my day job is I am a horseback riding instructor, so I know how to teach and communicate. But where's the boundary? And that was definitely a piece of feedback is, the problem areas in a story, it's not the editor, it's not the beta reader, it's not your job to fix it for the author. The author still has ultimate authority. So like what I like to do is I bring questions. And, some of the questions might be a little bit leading in the sense of like, this is my natural instinct of where I think this could land based on the way that you've set it up. So I'll ask questions that, may or may not lead you there. But to your point earlier, a lot of times the answer isn't in the feedback, but the answer may inspire, the author to take it in their own direction. Because again, it is the author's story, and it is the editor and the readers and the critique group's job to bring attention to those areas for work and improvement.
And I feel like in person, it just softens it some.
Correct.
I mean,
everything's better in person.
Bit. I think it's like it feels better to see people's faces. Now that can go in a negative direction too. If you feel like you're seeing people react negatively, or they might have like a judgmental face or any kind of like rejection body language, I think that can sting in a way that we want to minimize. And I think looking for fault in story is just not what we're doing. Right. I think, you look for strengths, like where was the heat, and then where are the opportunities? And that's it. That's how I frame the workshop, because that's revision, there's no fault
writing that down
in process.
We'll put that on a motivational poster too. Where is the
I love
heat
this.
And where's
You're still taking notes in my class.
Yes, I am. Okay. All right. I feel like we've covered extensively what workshop is and why it's good and why it's awesome. And if you are in the space to do more of your own furthering your education in terms of becoming a creative writer, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to go to a classroom. If you aren't ready to return to college, find a writing group. Like find places to surround yourself with other writers to try to get this style of feedback in a way that is constructive. That would be the big takeaway.
Like here in Charlotte, we have, I just want to plug Charlotte Lits. It's an arts organization that offers community writing workshop classes, that sort of thing. And people are at every level of practice. I mean, you have published authors there, you have new writers there, and many places, cities like Asheville has this. I mean, you can go all over and find local nonprofit organizations that are offering this, so you don't have to go into higher ed to experience it. So I just say research, see what's out there, take a chance.
But specifically back to what we experienced in Queens, like you mentioned, there was no time in a semester, and it was not going to be as in depth of a learning opportunity, I think, to have tried to write a book and then workshop it. And we were beginning writers. We had to start with a building block. So starting with a short story first, like you mentioned, it is, a little bit more of a one image, one feeling you're trying to evoke in your reader. So let's just dive into a little bit between the difference of a short story and novel, which we've touched on a little bit, and then how did we move from studying short form fiction into the long form?
I do think that the short story allows you to practice in a lower stakes way with different craft elements. So say you have never tried first person point of view and you want to try a voice piece, you can. And it's not going to take you 3 years where you've committed, an entire 80,000 words to a single voice. But maybe you wanted it in third person all along. So I think that getting to know point of view is a wonderful part of short fiction. Trying third person, trying second person, trying them all, because ultimately when you move to the novel, there's room to rotate points of view. I mean, you can have third person limited and first person if you want to, right? The novel really opens up opportunity for showing different subplots through different perspective in a way that the short story doesn't generally. Like a short story typically has what I call story A and story B. So there's the main arc of the story, and that's with a protagonist, main character that we're following through an arc towards some kind of shift by the end of the story, where we're making a choice or their perspective shifts, right? The classic James Joyce epiphany moment that we've heard about so many times, but you don't want a character that's starting at the same place and ending at the same place.
Right.
Right where there's this flatness. You're like, well, why did we just read this? What is that character's yearning? What's the desire? What's blocking it? And then how's that character shift? All of this applies to the novel. It's just that you're in a novel, you're going to have so many subplots potentially that's going to help develop that. And the arc of conflict is going to be larger and longer. But in the short story, you have that story A and it has a shape. And then you typically have a story B is what I call it. It's like, what's the second story that's interacting with story A? And yes, this is plot. It's also structure, but often it's about internal development too. So usually it's something about that character's backstory, like something about the past is weighing on the present. And is that not just true in life?
I'm also just laughing right now. I can so tell that you taught me, because I'm recording a little bit out of order trying to get all of our material together for this podcast launch, and I've definitely used that already, which is awesome. I'm feeling
the story A,
yes,
story
I'm feeling
B.
very validated. I'm like, all right, I remembered that. That was right.
That's good. Yeah. And I think not all short stories use that, but it's frequently there. And for beginning writers, it's a helpful way for encouraging them to think about shape and structure. That and the ABCDE format for short fiction can help you decide what direction you want to go in, because you have so few pages. You can't cover it all. So you need to know who that character is and what they're facing. What's going to be the main conflict and what's that character's yearning. And you have to find a scope that works for it. It's very, very hard. I mean, I feel like the short story is more akin to the poem. It's like the cousin to the poem more than it is related to the novel.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so, because every word counts, it's not. The novel has opportunity it's a baggier, you know, you can digress, you can pull in so many different perspectives and plot points. So I think the short story is also just about word counts. So we can get into the basics of that. 4,500 words is a max. And then you have, of course, micro stories, flash fiction, and there's all sorts of levels of short fiction for experimentation. To me, studying short fiction and looking at the artistry of short fiction will help you create more character-driven, more upmarket kind of fiction if you choose to write a novel. Because of the workshop model, the short story has been treated like training wheels that you then release and you're going to write that novel. The publishing industry treats it that way. You publish your first collection of short stories, and then your agent is going to expect you to have a novel. Your agent's not going to expect you to just be a short story writer for the rest of your career. So even the industry that has such a commercial goal is pushing people to treat the short story that way. And there are writers who do both really well, but I think of like a George Saunders, whose pressure on his career has always been to write the novel, and he's just a brilliant short story writer. Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, top short story writer, living writer right now. And he wrote Lincoln in the Bardo, and that was a novel technically, and was treated as such. But even within it, you see him at his best as a short story writer because of the way that he's structuring it. It almost reads like a collection, too, of short stories. But it just has an overall plot and is thinking about Lincoln after his son dies. And so that overarching plot is really kind of what holds the pieces together, and so serves as a premise and makes it feel like a novel, but it also feels like a collection of short stories. And so I think that the pressure is unfair to have to write a novel. You should want to write a novel. So if you're using short fiction because you know you want to write longer form fiction, that's fantastic. Like, it's smaller stakes, fail forward, practicing on a small scale. Right. But also, if you're somebody who wants to write short fiction, that learning curve is large, and you should be practicing all the time and studying just the short form to know how to do that well. And it's an incredible art form.
Yeah. I loved what you said about the short form being akin to poetry, because it is like two very different minded artists. I think the poet versus the novelist, because like you said, like the novelist can go on a tangent, they can digress, they can have this whole scene of banter just for, for comedic relief, like where a short form story can't. And like to be able to narrow it down is a whole other skill set in its own too, to be hyper successful. So I think, as a learning tool, yes, experiment, learn all the tricks of the trade, and then once if your goal is to write a novel, then apply those. But I think beyond the learning scope of the short story, to master the short story is a whole nother level of genius in its own, because you've got such a small, narrow field to get so much accomplished.
Well said. I think that distillation process, like what poets do and what short story writers do, is an incredible art form. So.
But for our purposes today, we're moving into the novel. Yes. So we have, so we know what workshop is. We know what a short story is and isn't, what it can and can't do. So say you use the word premise. We're going to go there next. We have a premise of a story. And if you've tinkered with it in short form, you've realized there's just so much more scope that you want to expand into a novel, because there's so many different directions and spider legs of the story that can shoot off in every direction, more than the scope of a short story could handle, because again, you're looking at a short form fiction in a very narrow focus. How do you move from short form to long form? Like, how do you take an idea and expand it into what would be a novel?
That's such a great
question. That's
probably
like 3 hours of talking and like an entire
hard question.
College education of let's jam it into an episode.
Because in some ways you're asking, how do you know if you have a small premise or a big premise?
I like that. Yeah, that's a good way of asking that.
Yeah. And that's hard. And some writers are just, they come up with an idea and they just know it's going to be a short story. Or they come up with an idea and it feels so big, they know that it must be a novel. So some of it is just by feeling, too. And some writers they try to tease out a premise in a short form way because it's lower stakes, just to see about voice, to see about potential conflicts, like how much could they build out of it, and then take it to a bigger concept. I brought in this book for us. So Culpability. It's a 2025 Oprah's Book Club pick by Bruce Holsinger.
Beautiful.
And we just hosted him at Queen's. Fantastic cover, amazing book. And it's so interesting. He came in and spoke to my students. Cool. So he was talking about premise. They asked him about it. And he told us, and this was fascinating to me, that the novel began in its conception as a family of 5 who had just experienced a tragedy, and that his first year of writing this manuscript was just following this family as they were under the pressure, or their relationships were under the pressure of this tragedy they experienced. That is not why this book is getting tons of attention. So this novel opens with a family of 5 in an autonomous driving minivan, And there's a 17-year-old son. He's like the golden child of the family. He's about to go play lacrosse at Chapel Hill on full scholarship. He's like an
Okay.
Adonis, and he's in the front seat. And he makes a very human, impulsive decision and jerks the wheel when it's in like AI driving
Oh,
mode, swerves and kills an elderly couple on the other side of the
oh
road.
boy.
And so then the novel investigates this family, the legal repercussions of like human choice versus AI control. And then look, I mean, there's whole sections where one of the children that was in the car is confessing her feelings, but you realize it's to an AI chatbot instead of telling her family. And she's like confessing some truths about that situation that her family needs to know about the legal ramifications of what happened in the car that day, but she's only sharing it with a chatbot. So this novel then takes on AI culture as we know it, that's rapidly evolving. Yes? And my
Yeah,
students were like, they were like, you didn't have that in the novel at the beginning? Like that wasn't your leading premise? Like your premise was going to be a family of 5 gets in a car accident and that's it? And that could be
that's
it.
wild.
Like that could be it. But maybe that's a short
Right.
story. Where you're focusing on one character who's most impacted by the
Hmm.
experience of that tragedy and really being inside that person's psyche, right? It's like really getting access to the feelings of, and then the nuanced feelings of going through something like that versus a novel where he is able to bring a chatbot in as a character. He writes entire like scholarly paper sections because the wife of the family, Lorelai, is as an AI ethicist, and she's extremely famous in her field. And so you see her thinking through the morality and ethics of AI, but we get to hear that in her research, like in the voice of her research. So he even has an entire New Yorker article with like a CEO of a kind of like open AI, like a big tech company that they realize over the course of the novel they're connected to. So it's just fun, right? It's like there's so much texture in the
What
novel.
do you call, sorry,
And
what do you call a book that incorporates essentially, I mean, it's all written word and pages, it's bound in a book, but it's essentially multimedia in terms of like different forms of storytelling. There's a word for that, isn't there? What's that called?
I mean, I always talk about found
Okay.
text. That's what it
Okay.
feels like. Instead of like found footage
Hmm.
and film, it's like found text, and then you're patching them
That's so
together.
fun.
Um, I mean, and part of the plot is delivered in these different kinds of mediums, genres that he's pulling
Hmm.
together. So plot reveals are happening there, but so is character
Right.
development. And he specifically called it texture. It's like he's texturizing the story by adding these different mediums and seeing how the larger cultural conversation unfolds around a topic like
Right.
AI. But when he was talking about his first draft of a premise, you thought, well, that's interesting, but like maybe that's not a blockbuster
Right.
premise. And then he adds AI, he adds some cultural context that is obviously of the moment, of the zeitgeist. And book clubs are going to be talking about this all year,
Yeah.
right? And Oprah picked it for her book club. That's a big picture
Right.
premise. And it's like, well, how do you know if you have one of those? And how do you build one of those? And clearly, he didn't have one of those. But he began writing it anyway because he was interested in this family and he was interested in tragedy. And he himself had survived a terrible accident as a young man. And so he, something deep inside of him wanted to investigate like how you move on from a tragedy like that and how it affects interpersonal relationships. So the family as a core unit is always super interesting for developing drama. But it wasn't enough. Like he didn't feel like it was enough. So he needed more real world drama to make it bigger. And not every novel is going to be topical in that way. Certain novelists want to be topical and take on big issues of the time, but you don't have to have that. And so it's like, well, what then makes it a big premise if you don't have it? Well, for the novel, time, like looking at maybe multiple generations of a family, for instance, covering historical periods, going pulling in characters from different time periods. I'm sure you've read novels like
Right.
this, where you're hearing the voice of, in maybe third person or first person, from someone that's living in the Great Depression, and then we rotate to a more present tense storyline. And so braiding voices together like that can make a novel bigger. It can create a bigger premise. But in the end, it is about story and what is the story about. And we are in a time of really thinking about identity. So, supporting voices that have traditionally not been represented as a really big push in contemporary fiction, and also thinking about identity, like who we are and the kind of conflicts that can come from that. So a quiet premise can become a novel. That's true. But more often than not, a quiet premise, I think, is going to invite the writer to ask bigger questions about, like, where is this headed? Why make it a novel, not a short story? How much room do you really need to tell the story in full for that premise? Right. And that's hard. The premise is an art form. And I'm just more and more convinced of that. Like, the longer I've been writing and that I've, like, gone down the rabbit hole of a premise that just wasn't quite right. Maybe wasn't quite big enough, and I've written full novel drafts, multiple drafts, following that premise. I've learned more about that the longer I've been writing than anything else. And it's so hard.
Yeah, I just listened to another podcast episode, and this one's actually like a fantasy writing podcast, but the episode was talking about outlining, and basically doing the same thing. Like, you have this idea for a book premise, and put it through the ringer. Try to expand your idea into not even necessarily, hitting the plot points, which we'll talk about in a bit, which even though that is important as a writer, having a little checklist, knowing where you're going, but even just answering big picture questions. And if you can't answer every question because your idea is still percolating and expanding, fine. But, like, it's got to be able to, like, in that moment, fine. But it's got to be able to at least spark that creativity and your own mind to ask yourself questions and try to find your own answers to be able to expand it. Because if the premise that you're toying with falls short, or there's just not enough material to spiderweb out, then it's not going to be a novel, I don't think.
Yes, I think that's fair. And yeah, I'm sure you've heard this phrasing. There's like pantsers.
Oh yeah.
Right, I write by the seat of my pants. And then there's outliners, which, like, sort of suggests that some people are more one than the other. But I think there's just a relationship between them, because even if you do outline and you're like, okay, I got this, I think this will be a novel, I've got enough, I've teased it out, I like what you said about that. When you're in the process of writing to an outline, you're going to still have moments of pantsing where the character's making choices that you could not have anticipated in an outline, and you're going to follow that. And so it's just a more intuitive experience of writing.
Love that.
I think a happy medium is good. Like, I think pantsing your way all the way through a novel, done it multiple times, and then realized that, that maybe it wasn't big enough.
Yeah.
It wasn't big enough in premise at the beginning, and that outlining would be useful. And I go back and forth on outlining and not outlining. I feel like I make outlines just to break them too sometimes, but it's a useful process.
That's why I personally, and you can tell me I'm wrong, when I am an outliner, I feel like I can't get started if I don't see some sort of the picture. And I love what you just said about, the hybrid relationship of outlining and pantsing. If you are an outliner, you're still pantsing in the middle of the scene. Like, it might take you in a little bit different direction. Like, that's where that flex of that imagination muscle that you're working on in workshop to tie things back. Like, you have to be able to flex that and, like, move in a different direction and let your characters take you. I have no idea where I was going with that. I had a tangent in my head and now it's gone.
Well, you are a pretty big outliner, I feel like. And I feel that in your work, I feel it when I'm reading it, and I like that feeling. And we'll talk about this with the 3-act structure. There's some security to it for the reader. The reader has certain expectations. And I love that about the 3-act structure, but we'll get there. So what were you going to say about your outlining?
My point was, with outlining, I don't marry myself to leading into the 3-act. We'll go there next. I have a fairly good idea of where I'm going, act 1, act 2, and then act 3. Like, I leave that intentionally kind of loose because of the pantsing within scene and the questions that may come up. Like, I don't have a lot of extra time, and because I have a huge day job and now all these other little passion projects. So when I sit down to write, like, I have this I don't know, fear of wasting time, which is ridiculous because it's such a
Mm,
long, drawn out process. So you are going to spend a lot of time waffling, noodling with ideas and whatnot. But I don't marry myself to the third act when I've done an outline because so much can change. I don't want to, essentially feel that fear of I've wasted time committing myself to a third act, but by the time I get there, the novel's gone in a different direction too. So, and that's something I had to learn because I would stress so much before I would start about like, I don't know how it's going to end. I can't start yet versus just applying some of that pantsing and getting in to the meat of the story and letting that kind of form, as I hit like the halfway point, I'll have like an aha moment as a writer and be like, this is what the story meant to say because of that internal B story that I'm kind of learning along the way with my characters, which shaped then that third act. And then I'll stop writing, skip ahead, do a little outline for act three, and then keep going. And sometimes I'll start and
interesting.
stop even a couple more times, learning new things about my characters by the ending. But that is, I do outline, but I leave that third act a little bit up for the characters to tell me where we're heading for that B story part.
And I'm so fascinated by people who start with the
I
ending.
know. I talked to someone else on the podcast. She's like, I know exactly how my story's ending. I'm like, I'm jealous. I have no idea how you do that.
Or like they begin with the ending and then right to
Hmm.
it. I find that so compelling, and I don't know if my brain just doesn't work that far into the
Yeah.
future. I mean,
Well, and
I don't know. Like I don't know how one would do that, but I'm
I
fascinated by it.
found through again like just chatting with other authors and pulling together episodes, a whole other structure I didn't know existed was the 7 point story structure.
Hmm. There's also five. I mean,
Yeah,
there's like five,
where you
seven.
and
I
you
mean,
like have to have social media. I think it's the 7 point where you start with the ending. You start with the ending and you know exactly what you're going to write, and then you go back to the beginning and you make sure that opening image is some sort of parallel to it, and then you just work back and forth like that till you end up in the midpoint, and then you start
hmm
writing. Like that's how you outline the book. And I'm like, that is a good step-by-step formula, I think, to, if you were interested in knowing more of where your story ended, if you weren't so much, and I was gonna say if you weren't so much of an exploratory writer and you needed to know where you were going. But in genre, I think thrillers and mysteries work really well. I think it'd be very hard to write a thriller or mystery story not knowing how it ended as the writer. Like I think you would have to know the ending
that's
and then work
true.
backwards.
Yes, some of this is genre
Hmm.
dependent. I agree with that. And but for me as a writer, part of the joy for me is not
Yeah.
knowing. That like a reader, and there's always surprises along the way. Robert Frost always said, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. No surprises for the writer, no surprises for the
Yeah.
reader. And I relate to this, but I don't think it means that if you choose your ending, you're not going to have surprises or tears along the way. That pantsing experience when you're in scene is that kind of
I
spontaneity.
love that. That's the first time I've thought
Um,
about it like
I
that. That is lovely. I like that.
If you're trying to over control your story, though, I would ask
Hmm.
why. So just why not give it some freedom?
Yeah. Let it breathe. It's organic. The human
Hmm.
experience is organic.
It is, and so is your
Yeah.
imagination. And part of getting to know your imagination is writing it down. And so trying to always plan that out, it's like you're in an administrative brain when you really want to be in a creative
Hmm.
space. So that's what's interesting about the novel is that there's so much organization, so much structure, and so much structure readers come to the novel expecting that you do have to manage that administrative brain with the creative brain. Less so with short fiction. And I think short fiction really invites a lot of experimentation with structure, so it can kind of keep you in that creative brain. But how you and I think that's the hardest part of the novel actually is how you balance that administrative like deeply reasoned ideas about structure with allowing your story to have that kind of life and spontaneity and creative
Yeah. I
direction.
think that is the risk, probably a little bit of this platform's running too, where we're trying to give readers tools and resources to structure and um, step by step formulas essentially. But I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
say, be careful. Don't lock yourself into this because of that, you know, let if we're writing there, you are imagining and let that be, I
Yeah.
would say, the gas pedal. of your process too, which is just the GPS.
And it should be fun. And so
It's
what
fun,
fun
guys.
means for
It's
you.
fun.
It is so much fun, even when it's
Yeah.
hard. It should be also hard, but it should be the kind of fun hard that you keep coming back to. And it's a compulsion for
Hmm.
me. I mean, that it just can't seem to stop thinking in story. It's how I process the world, which makes me a strange human being, I think. But other writers get
Yeah.
it. That's why we find each other. That's why we're in community, because we're like, doesn't everyone make a story out of what they're experiencing in reality? They don't do that? Why
Well,
aren't
they're
they
missing
doing
out.
that?
They're missing out
Like,
for sure.
you're missing out, but it is a different way of perceiving. And it's nice to be with other people who perceive in a narrative
Hmm.
way. So community is good, but figuring out what the fun is for you is important.
Yeah.
But it should be fun.
I feel like really sad to leave that conversation. I feel like I'm back in college again, actually. Like a lot of our classes weren't necessarily lecture based; they were discussion based, and we would go on
Hmm.
these exploratory tangents and come away feeling like again we flexed those muscles a little bit. I miss it. I miss you. It's great.
I miss you too. You were such an amazing student. I mean, Megan, you came in just driven, ready to go. You knew what you wanted to do, and you were already so accomplished as an equestrian. So I was so amazed by
Thank
you,
you.
and I thought you were such an interesting character. But you were mature, you were hungry, and I could tell you processed your world through
Yeah.
story.
Thank you.
So when you wanted to write a novel and came to me with pitching an independent study, I was like, absolutely. I couldn't do that with every
Yeah.
student. I couldn't, but I could. I already could see that you thought in a long form way.
Thank you.
So
Well, it meant a
you
lot.
needed the
It meant a lot.
space.
So yeah, that independent study turned into the right words, which I actually don't have any. I've got the wingman up there. I don't have my first book in
Well,
here.
that then turned into the Wingman, right? One
There she
novel,
is.
then a second novel. I'm so proud of
Thank
you.
you. Thank
So
you.
proud of you.
We've talked a lot, but I do want to run through, I guess, quickly, if you don't mind, going through what is the three act story structure real quick.
I mean, I'm here as long as you want to talk to me.
I could talk to you all day.
But
All right. Well, we'll just run through the beats real quick. Again, I think a lot of these episodes that we're going to be doing are breaking down, step by steps that you can follow. But I think this conversation that we've had so far was so good to understand a little bit of the backstory of how we got to this point of sitting down to write a book, but also the why behind it too, which I've loved. This has been great.
Yes.
So we'll run through this quickly. So three acts in our novel, beginning, middle, and end. They have fancy words. Act number one can be referred to as our setup. That usually runs 0 to 25% of the novel, 0 to 30% of the novel. Essentially, the goal of Act One is to situate your characters and your readers in their ordinary world before they would essentially embark on the quest of what the novel is about. And I just read an interesting kind of blog post article from the internet. We were pulling my notes together for this episode, and I thought this author put this framework together very simply, and it clicked in my brain. Three acts. Her name is Mary Adkins. She's an author and a book coach. She outlined Act One as saying your character has a problem. I have a problem. And then Act Two is their character saying, I think I know how to solve this problem. And then Act Three was, I was wrong. And this is how we're going to actually fix this problem. And I thought that was, interesting, comical, and correct, because a lot of the B story journey that we talked about is your character thinking they want something and going on, certain steps, certain plot points, and internal quests to get there, and then realizing their want wasn't necessarily their need. They were wrong in some way because they learned their thematic lesson by the end of the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how succinct that is. I think that's a very accessible way to understand it. With risk of like oversimplifying, we don't want to oversimplify how complicated those yearnings and those conflicts can be. Because sometimes it's not just one thing
Right.
that isn't a want or a need that you're experiencing, and it can affect other characters too. And so how that cast of characters comes together to help the main character realize this core truth by the end of the novel, I think is a complicated endeavor. I think as a starting point.
Yes.
It's good. Yeah.
So the first beat in our Act One setup, exposition, set the stage. Readers should learn about their character and their everyday world. We need to be grounded in some form or fashion. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I learned this term with you, probably more applicable to the short form instead of the long form in medias res, starting in the middle of things,
I think it's
or important.
applicable to
Okay,
both.
perfect.
I mean,
Perfect.
yeah, I think starting in the middle of things as a Greek term, I think more and more fiction does that. I think our attention span for exposition, for setting the world up at the start is lower. And part of that is because we've been consuming so many stories. Like you said at the beginning of this podcast, we are so awash in narrative that readers need less setup than they used to. I think so. Just comparing like 19th century fiction to 20th century fiction, then to 21st century fiction, you just see less and less establishment of the world as it is before the inciting incident, and it's more like we're like in the midst of the inciting incident when we open.
Yeah, no, for
and
sure.
then we go from there.
For sure. Especially, and again, because we are, like you said, that awash in so much narrative, your readers are two things that we need to remember. They're smart. They're smarter than we think because they have consumed so many stories. And their attention span is limited. We are, back to that competition idea. Like, we're not I would say, in competition with other writers necessarily because we are sharing the same audience, because our audience wants to keep reading our stories together. But you are in competition with your reader, I would say, to a certain extent. You can't afford to lose their attention in the beginning. So this exposition beat, I would warn, we need to be grounded, but it doesn't need to take chapters and chapters because we need to get that story going, which is our next plot point, the inciting incident. This is the catalyst that sets the story in motion. So we have our characters rooted in their normal everyday. Something has to happen. The catalyst sets the story, that ball rolling down the hill of we're going to go on a little bit of a journey. And then we're hitting our plot point number 1. So whatever the catalyst, whatever that action beat was that set up the momentum for the story, plot point 1 is your character deciding to do something in response to that catalyst, I would say. Without the catalyst, the story would never kickstart. Without the plot point number 1, your B story wouldn't start, because that B story is that internal transformation within your character. They can only transform inside based on the choices that they make. Now, back to that oversimplified, I have a problem and I think I know how to solve it. This is where they're going to try to make the decision to solve it that may or may not be correct, I would say. Or at least, they're going to learn along the way, different life lessons based on the choices they made for inciting incident number 1.
Can I use an example from Culpability just to start to outline Act 1 and 2? And you should put the book in show notes.
Yes, I will.
Yeah. Okay. And so in medias res, the book starts, they're in the minivan. And by the end of chapter 1, they've murdered that elderly couple. Now, accidental, whose fault, we don't know. But this book follows a 3-act structure. It's all it's got, and yet it absolutely defies some of the percentages we're talking about here.
Oh, I love that.
This is Act 1. This is Act 1. See how skinny that is? This is Act 2.
Wow.
And then Act 3 is actually the largest act.
Oh,
I mean,
cool.
Look at how thick. Look at that, right? So he's doing something quite different with the 3-act structure, yet he's following your path here. He's completely following it. And so that catalyst, and I can't reveal all of what's happening because it just reveals too much. We should read the book.
Sounds so good.
It is great. But the family is in the process of the inciting incident. They just don't know it yet. But by the end of Act 1, they find out that there are going to be legal ramifications for their son. Like, he needs a lawyer at the end of Act 1, right? That their son, who's got his whole future ahead of him, might face some very serious consequences for what happened in the car in that inciting incident. And it's a really small, it's the shortest first act of a novel I've ever read, which I find really fascinating. And then Act 2, as we say here, the confrontation, where we go and we think that we need to solve it. So the story is told in first person point of view for most of the novel, and it's the father,
Mhm.
and the father he's like helicopter dad, right? He wants to solve this problem for his son so badly. And to do that, what do? Well, they're an upper middle class family, and they get out of town. They go to the eastern shore of Virginia, and they sequester themselves in a new world. And I think that's what's interesting between Acts 1 and Acts 2 in stories, that you do go from the world as it is. Like their world, even though they're in the inciting incident, they're driving to a lacrosse tournament for their golden child when this
Right.
happens. That's what they've always been doing. They're doing club lacrosse, making sure that he's set up to have a super successful life for all of their kids. This is the kind of family that we're dealing with. Act 2, new world. And it's an upside down world.
I love that term. The
Right?
upside down world. Yes.
Yeah, the upside down world is that they're no longer the family they thought they were. They're all injured from this, and they're facing very serious consequences as a family, and it's affecting their relationships. So we put them in a new world. They're in a beautiful vacation home, because they're super privileged, and yet inside that home they are at deep odds with one another, almost to the point where they can't trust one another. And you're trying to figure out who is at fault. And that takes you all the way through Act 2, which is really fascinating. Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot. So how would you say, okay, so our three main plot points during the confrontation Act 2 are rising action. Our new journey goal is in motion. Characters face a roadblock. They've got new surroundings, new characters. We've got our midpoint, significant middle event, something goes wrong, the stakes are raised, and then plot point 2 is a result of that midpoint. This can be a little bit more of a reflection, a redirection. This is where your characters often are moving from kind of a passive state of following along the plot points that have happened to them thus far and consciously making a choice to take the story in the new direction, which is into Act 3. I don't know how much I don't want to spoil the book for anyone. But is there any?
I don't either.
Okay.
I don't want to spoil it. There's so many wonderful plot reveals in Act 2 of this novel. But I'll say that the marriage at the core of this is an important driver in Act 2, because there's a lot about his wife's work that he doesn't know. And there's also elements of what was happening in the minivan that day that, because they're all limited in their perspective, they don't all know what was happening. And so Act 2 creates, in this new surroundings, opportunities for characters to reveal what they know and what they've been up to all along the way. And that serves as the rising action, those plot reveals all along. And our main character has to process almost his helplessness. Like at the beginning, he's super in control and he feels they're a fixer family. They've got connections and privilege. And it's a process of realizing that they can't fix and they can't control their son's future. Right. And in the process of Act 2, new characters, new surroundings, they are at a beautiful home that's next to this enormous estate owned by the CEO of an open AI, like Silicon Valley tech company mogul. And their son and that person's daughter make a love connection. And so they become even more sort of out of control as the novel goes on. So there's a teen romance at the center of the Act 2 confrontation. And it's not an easy romance. No. The power dynamic is off. Like, they're so wealthy and so of another world, even though this is a very privileged family at the core of the story. So it feels doomed from the beginning. Yeah. Right. And they can't really control where that's going to go or what it reveals about the main tragedy, the story A. Of the novel. And so I find all of that fascinating, and yet those two acts are not as big as Act 3 for this novel. And I can't stress enough how unusual that is, how I haven't quite seen that kind of structure before, and it works.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about structure, and once you know and are very comfortable with moving between the beats, the plot points, the acts, on a traditional sense, again, we're competing for our readers' attention. I think by intentionally, I would say still have to hit these points to make your story rounded, successful, and whole, but playing like this author did, and the length and duration of these beats was very experimental and rewarded. Um,
Hmm.
Before we move on to Act Three, I think an interesting point that was just brought up, I guess, based on this book. So in a high stakes epic fantasy genre, you've got I would say external plot points that are happening to your characters. They're learning their new world. There's a lot that's going on. There's I would say certain things and events that would be your plot points in Act Two as they're in their upside down world. Obviously there's
Hmm.
no magic in this narrative system, but I think tools that you can use, like you were just saying, that this author does well is plot reveals, and that is done very well. And it can be done if you are telling a book in multiple perspectives, because one character may know something that the other didn't. This one is told in one perspective, so the reader is being fed information as your narrator is learning it. Is that correct?
It is, but there are moments where we move into the AI chatbot
Oh, okay.
relationship, and there are some plot reveals that happen there that are pretty
I love that.
critical. But it's mostly through first person point of view, and he is limited in what he's learning, and he is learning through other
Yeah.
characters.
So those
So,
reveals.
and there's a lot of tension.
I gotta read this. This sounds so interesting. All right, moving into Act Three. So again, just our narrative structure that you can take and then apply on your own. So the end of Act Two is plot point number two, making a decision to react to the midpoint. That decision moves us into Act Three, which is the resolution, which is, I would say, traditionally the final quarter of the book. You're saying this book made the choice to have the resolution much, much larger. Um,
Hmm.
but our main points within our 3 act structure in the resolution is our pre-climax. Fears and flaws are exploited. A final showdown between our protagonist and antagonist. This is often a multi-scene beat where you've got an action and then you reflect on it, an action, then you reflect on it. These are all the climbing staircase, I would say, that's leading to your climax, which would traditionally be a single scene beat, a final moment of the main conflict. And then you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of our last plot point. I'm going to butcher it. I know we learned it in school.
The denouement.
Denouement. Yes. Tie up loose ends.
It's French.
Make sure our goals were achieved. Um, so again, I don't want to spoil this book for anyone. Is there any final notes to say on his choices to have this resolution in a much larger chunk than traditionally written?
So what's so interesting is though the sort of the word count changes uh, compared to a traditional 3 act
Hmm.
structure. He is following a lot of these
Hmm.
beats in a more traditional way. So I don't want to give away the
That's fine. Don't.
ending.
I don't
I
want you to
definitely
either.
think you all should read this book, and I will not be surprised if it becomes like a Hulu
That's
miniseries.
awesome.
So there's that too, which adaptation is super fascinating. But he does have resolution. It's a complicated
Hmm.
resolution. I mean, I felt conflicted at the end of the novel about who this family is now on the other side of all of this experience. And I think that's what's powerful about Act Three is you have a new hero, right? They should be transformed, but it's not always transformed for the better.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think in the traditional hero's journey, we think about the hero going through strife, through tribulation, through death of the self and a rebirth, and then bringing that back to the community, and that's always seems like a net positive experience. And most of the time, I think that it is. But in this novel, I worry for this family, both in that they are new and they are transformed, but that they might be making the same choices again in the
Mhm.
future. That there's some level of not being able to learn what they needed to learn, mostly because of the culture around them. Like AI, and I think it is indicative of our experience with AI that even if there are negative outcomes, there's still this pursuit of innovation that seems like an inherent good. Does that make sense? Even if there are consequences. And so this family sort of models that ethos.
I think a conversation, an episode, a whole probably other series would be talking about the threat of AI in the creative space too, as a writer, because I hear a lot of podcasts talking about what a threat it is. And then I was just at an event last night with friends that work in a corporate setting, and how it is tough for us in our real world facing job layoffs because AI can replace so many human jobs essentially, and how they're being forced to be trained on AI to reduce the use of a human workforce, which is just wild and a whole other tangent that I don't have enough information in my own brain to try to get into. But it would be an interesting conversation in a narrow field in a creative space, like the threat that it has on the youth and the writers coming up behind us. Who and like I signed my contract for Wingman, and there was a clause in the publisher's agreement they had to say AI was not used in this book. Like that's a wild thing that was not a thing years and years ago, but it is now.
No, that's, yeah, more and more you're seeing that. I mean, I think that would be a great episode, and maybe multiple
Yeah.
episodes, just because there's so much debate happening about what role it should or could or should not
Hmm.
have in this creative space. It's a complicated topic. I know that my own works were used to train OpenAI's
Yeah. Yeah.
data. So, multiple writers that I know, our work was used without
Yep.
permission, and it's been part of some large class action
Yeah.
suits. And I don't know what the end result of all of that will be, but they're sucking up as much data as possible. Like the more data they have, the better trained the LLMs are, and so they did a lot of that with pirated material.
Yeah. It's scary.
So it's like it's a strange feeling. It's strange,
Yeah.
and I think it's hard to detect usage, and where's the line between using it as a tool for brainstorming and for creativity, and then actually producing text with it. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll get into that not right now.
Well,
But
that's another conversation.
it is
And
interesting.
these are the early days.
Yeah.
Yes, but you should. I encourage you to take that conversation forward.
Okay. I love that. Wow, I think we covered so much today. I can't thank you enough for coming on and chatting and just
You're
bringing your
welcome.
wealth of knowledge and perspective to us here. Because I think, again, like you said, the writer's lens that we look at the world through is so different and fascinating. And I think it's a way to rationalize the things that happen around us if we could, tell ourselves a story.
Hmm. Helps us process. It's important for your psychological health. I think
Yeah.
it could be really
Yeah.
hard too. But I'm so grateful that you invited me on. This was so much
Well,
fun.
thank you. This was great, and I'll sign off now. We can keep chatting for a little bit, but thank you again for
Okay,
joining us,
sounds
and
good.
we'll
Absolutely.
chat soon.